Thank you all so much. It's a delight to be here today in Baltimore. I spent the morning in Washington, and yesterday I was in Berlin, and so I'm feeling a little bit like I'm moving a bit too fast, and Baltimore is a place I know well and really like, and I'm here with people I also know well and like, so I get a chance to catch my breath here, so thank you very much. I know you're devoting time today to Syria. I'm going to make remarks about the whole international scene on the millions and millions of migrants and refugees. But you'll notice that I keep coming back to Syria as an example because it's the one that has really caught the attention of the entire Washington foreign policy establishment as a really, really tough dilemma on how we're going to resolve that crisis. And we see that the situation continues on, and that the people affected by it continue to need help, more and more people affected and more people needing help as time goes by. So in recent weeks, the world has been riveted by the largest refugee crisis Europe has faced in generations. The tragic stories and images we've seen remind us these are families just like our own. These are toddlers who wear little sneakers. They have been torn out of their normal lives and subjected to horrors because of the accident of where they were born. Why is this happening and what can be done? Europe's dilemma is one dimension of a global problem, and it is not a new problem. Roughly 60 million people have been driven from their homes around the world, more than at any time since World War II. So what's new is the scale of the problem. Americans can take heart that we are already a leader in helping refugees and delivering aid around the world. We also lead the world in resettling refugees in this country. Today I want to tell you about refugees, internally displaced persons, and migrants, how they are similar and different, and what more we can do to help them. Why are there record numbers of people on the move? In the past 5 years, violence has erupted, smoldered, or flared anew, terrorizing and scattering civilians from Syria, Ukraine, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, northeastern Nigeria, and Burundi. Protracted crises continue in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, Burma, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Today's conflicts are not just numerous, they are often brutal, chronic, and intractable. Long-term, unceasing violence or oppression means that uprooted people aren't able to go home. 45% of refugees today are displaced for 5 years or more, and some for many more. A child born in a refugee camp at the start of a crisis will often spend his or her entire childhood away from home. In some situations, camp midwives deliver the grandchildren of the original refugees. Refugees, who numbered 19.5 million last year, make up just one segment of the population on the move. The legal definition of a refugee is someone who has fled across international borders because they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. But most of the 60 million people displaced globally are not refugees. Approximately 38 million are internally displaced persons, or IDPs, who have not crossed international borders. For instance, when ISIL, or Daesh, seized roughly a third of Iraq, more than 3 million people fled to other parts of Iraq, especially to the Kurdish areas in the northeast of the country. IDPs do not enjoy the same type of protection that refugees do under international treaties. The 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol do not apply to them. International organizations once refrained from helping IDPs for fear of violating member states' sovereignty. Turmoil, civil wars, and atrocities in the 1990s in the Balkans, Haiti, Rwanda, and elsewhere prodded the United Nations to adopt IDP guidelines in 1998. African nations drafted and signed on to the more binding Kampala Convention a decade later. Still, responsibility for helping IDPs rests primarily with their own governments, and sometimes these governments are the problem. Syria is home to 7.6 million IDPs, or 1/5 of the world's total. The Assad regime drops barrel bombs on its own people, destroying hospitals and schools and killing rebels and civilians alike. In South Sudan, leaders have put their own feuds ahead of the welfare of their people, repeatedly pushing the country to the brink of famine, ensuring that one of the world's poorest countries remains that way. Despite the recently signed peace agreement, government and opposition forces continue to violate the ceasefire they agreed to honor. The Geneva Conventions state that non-combatants must be treated humanely. International humanitarian law prohibits directing attacks against civilians, including civilian humanitarian personnel delivering assistance. But militias and governments alike flout these rules. Despite 2 UN Security Council resolutions authorizing the delivery of aid into Syria, humanitarian workers continue to be harassed, threatened, or even killed. In South Sudan, combatants have attacked food convoys, kidnapped and killed aid workers, and fired mortars and rocket-propelled grenades into UN compounds where terrified civilians seek refuge. So let's review. Refugees are people who leave their own country to save themselves from persecution or war, and internally displaced persons, or IDPs, are those who flee the violence but try to survive within the boundaries of their home country. So, who are the migrants? A migrant is anyone on the move from country to country. A migrant can be a hotly recruited technology expert with a visa for a job in California, or a poor person without papers willing to take any job. Like IDPs and refugees, migrants traveling without documents can be exceptionally vulnerable. Americans have been shocked by images of half-starved people from Bangladesh and Burma abandoned on boats by ruthless smugglers, and reports of boats sinking and capsizing in the Mediterranean, drowning hundreds of migrants at a time. In these cases, economic migrants are suffering alongside the refugees. Both are subject to the same threats. They can be abused, raped, kidnapped, or crammed into the same trucks, cages, and leaky rubber boats. In Malaysia and Indonesia, traumatized Bangladeshis told me about being starved and beaten by the crew on ships and seeing bodies dumped overboard. So we would argue that the refugees from Burma have the right to asylum, but the economic migrants from Bangladesh, countries can have the right to return them to their country because they are fleeing poverty. So they get differential treatment. But our point to the nations of the world is everyone, every migrant should be treated humanely. The International Organization for Migration has estimated that 10 to 15% of the world's migrants, or between 23 and 35 million people, are undocumented. Even if they reach their destinations, the undocumented remain vulnerable. People who falsify documents, overstay visas, or work in an underground economy often fear deportation if they go to police or others for help when they need it. Sovereign nations, of course, are not obligated to or capable of opening their borders to everyone seeking a better life, but migrants need to be carefully screened and protected if being sent home would put them at risk. The United States leads in contributing to humanitarian operations around the world. We do this chiefly by working with top UN and other international organizations in this field. My bureau funds the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, and others. The U.S. Agency for International Development funds the World Food Program and the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And we also channel relief dollars through other UN agencies like UNICEF and through the best non-governmental organizations and charities that work in the field. These operations deliver essential life-saving assistance, food, shelter, medical care, and clean water and sanitation. They protect the rights of the displaced, care for survivors of sexual violence, reunify families, educate children and youth, and help people gain the skills they need to be self-sufficient. We can do this year after year because of steadfast support from Congress. Even in an era when bipartisanship often seems dead, lawmakers continue to come together to generously fund humanitarian efforts. Lawmakers have also supported our refugee resettlement program, which identifies some of the world's most vulnerable refugees, bringing them here and offers them a fresh start. And when I say here, I also mean Baltimore. The United States resettles more refugees than all other countries combined. Most refugees get jobs, enroll their children in school, pay taxes, revitalize communities, and after 5 years, many choose to take the test to become naturalized U.S. citizens. They contribute immeasurably to the life of our nation. As you may have heard, next year we will accept at least 10,000 refugees from Syria. Some critics say that number is too low. Others oppose admitting Syrians, arguing that terrorists may seek to enter the United States as refugees. The U.S. government is taking every possible precaution, screening applicants with extensive security checks and lengthy in-person interviews. This process is deliberately thorough and careful, and thus takes time. The days of airlifting thousands of refugees and bringing them to Guam or Fort Dix, New Jersey, ended on September 11th, 2001. We are, however, determined to do more to help the world's refugees. This is why Secretary Kerry announced yesterday in Berlin that the United States would increase the numbers of refugees we bring to the United States each year from the current level of 70,000 to 85,000 in fiscal year 2016 and 100,000 in fiscal year 2017. U.S. humanitarian aid and diplomacy are vital. In crisis after crisis, we have been able to spearhead the international response and use our influence to help keep borders open and aid flowing. This has helped save millions of lives. But today, aid groups are stretched thin. The World Food Program has been forced to cut food rations to Syrian refugees in the Middle East. In fact, all of the UN humanitarian organizations are grappling with severely insufficient funds to address a long list of crises. The United Nations is seeking $19.5 billion for humanitarian assistance. This is for all crises, not just Syria, for 2015. And we're now 3/4 of the way through the UN's fiscal year. It's received less than 1/3 of that. The United States has pledged or contributed half of the funds raised to date. And I believe today we'll be announcing additional funding for the Syria crisis. How can we close this yawning gap and meet such vast needs? Private giving could help. In just 1 week after the photo of the drowned Syrian toddler hit social media, donations for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF jumped more than 600%. The charity Save the Children raised 4 times more in that week than it had over the previous 8 months. This is a big change from earlier patterns of giving, and the question for me is whether this level of engagement will last. In general, even people who give generously for disaster relief tend to shy away from man-made crises. After Haiti's devastating 2010 earthquake, donations poured in. Half of all American households are reported to have contributed money. The U.S. aid agency World Vision raised $36 million from Americans in 2010 after the Haiti earthquake. Now, in the first week after the Haiti earthquake, World Vision raised $6 million. In the first 4 years of the Syria crisis, they raised $2.7 million from the public for their response to that calamity. So we see that there's just so much more comfort in giving quickly to a natural disaster and some less of a response to man-made crises. And I think it's because man-made crises can be messy and complex. Image after image of bombings, barbed wire, and misery can be overwhelming, even numbing. But 7 million children have been affected by Syria's crisis. Millions have suddenly found themselves impoverished. Young daughters are married off, and many children are unable to go to school and forced to work so that their families have enough to eat. Children have witnessed war and terror and are traumatized. A whole generation urgently needs help and care, and that is why my colleagues and I support the No Lost Generation campaign launched by UN agencies and non-governmental organizations. No Lost Generation and Children of Syria are the 2 hashtags to follow to join the conversation. To cope with the magnitude of crises we are facing, we also need more nations to contribute what they can, and this is what I think Court was talking about when I walked in. Countries already shouldering enormous responsibilities need help. Because of Syria's war, Germany now leads the world in taking in asylum seekers or refugees who travel on their own to a new country and then petition to stay. Turkey now hosts more refugees than any other nation, and Lebanon has absorbed so many Syrians that every fourth person living there is now a refugee. But other nations, too, are coping with large influxes of people in need. Uganda accepts refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, and Burundi, and allows them to work and farm to support themselves. Ethiopia hosts refugees from Eritrea in the north, Sudan and South Sudan to the west, and Somalia in the south. 2 years ago, I traveled to Burkina Faso and was amazed. The Burkinabe, the people of Burkina, had not only opened their border to refugees from Mali, they had let them bring their cattle and other animals and shared their pasture lands too. And there's a first time for everything, and this was my first time meeting refugee animals. The same handful of nations that always provides financial backing for aid operations is doing it now. In addition to the United States, these traditional donors include Western European governments, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and more recently, Korea. At critical junctures in the past few years, the Saudis, Kuwaitis, and Emiratis have given hundreds of millions of dollars to help cope with emergencies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. But donations from the Gulf countries have not always flowed through UN agencies and tend to come as one-off, unique contributions. I would like to see these countries become regular annual donors and contribute through top-notch aid agencies. This can ensure funding is not wasted and is well allocated and coordinated. We also would like to see some of the world's other established and rising economic powers, like Brazil, Russia, India, and as Court said, China, more engaged on humanitarian issues. We are also funding programs that are more efficient. For instance, the majority of the refugees live not in camps, but in cities and towns. Instead of handouts, they may need to be handed an ATM card, or better yet, a work permit. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, vulnerable groups such as women and children, the elderly, and the disabled need aid tailored for them. Relief and development experts need to collaborate to help countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Chad, and Niger that have taken in huge numbers of refugees despite their fragile economies. Development agencies should build more classrooms, hospital wards, and water systems so that societies hosting refugees do not suffer for doing the right thing. The World Humanitarian Summit that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has scheduled for spring 2016 offers an opportunity to call attention to what does and doesn't work in humanitarian response and recruit more governments and organizations to invest in best practices. We can help governments respond humanely when migrants and refugees arrive at their borders. We can crack down on human smuggling and explore legal alternatives to dangerous irregular migration. Legal migration can fill gaps in the labor pool, provide a financial lifeline to families and communities back home. Finally, and most importantly, we must stay vigilant and engaged and take whatever action we can to stop ethnic, religious, and political rivalries from exploding into violence. We must do what we can to prevent life from being so bleak that risking death seems preferable. We cannot magically inoculate the world against poverty and war, but we can build up resistance. This means strengthening programs run by the State Department and the U.S. Agency for National Development that foster the rule of law, fight corruption, create economic opportunity overseas. The point is that whatever we do, however incremental it is, matters. Whether they are visible under the glare of TV cameras arriving in Europe or in more remote corners of the earth, each person fleeing has a story. Often these are stories of incredible determination to survive, to protect their families, and to make something of their lives. They seek safety, but also seek the dignity all people deserve. Despite borders and barriers, despite our different circumstances, our fates are linked, and their fate should not only be theirs, but our own. Thank you very much.